Welcome to this extended minute tip video. When I started this series of minute tips about adding color to our ancestors' lives through research, I thought I would share how to use Google Maps to look at the modern version of our ancestors' homes, and that would pretty much be it. But as typically happens in genealogy, things aren't always that simple. I've stated before that I really enjoy filling in details about my ancestors' lives in between their major life events. And so that's what I was doing for Erskine Reed, who is listed in the 1900 US federal census in Nashville, Tennessee. And his address, as a review, is listed as 627 Boscobel Street. One thing I'd like to point out here that hasn't been pointed out in the previous videos is that he was a renter. And that's important because it dictates what other records we might be able to look for about this address. We also checked Google Maps and we noted that 627 Boscobel Street no longer exists today. And a lot of folks might say, well, why does this matter? What's the big deal? So what? And as emerging genealogists who, as we try to improve our work quality, we've now been introduced to a piece of evidence, the 1900 federal census, that states Erskine Reed lived at 627 Boscobel Street. And we've got another piece of evidence, the Google Maps, that indicates that 627 Boscobel Street no longer exists. So when we're doing research, we always have the opportunity to either stop or continue on. And when we have conflicting evidence, I encourage you to continue on. We considered how weather impacts this case, and I encourage you to always consider how weather affects your genealogy research. I was able to identify on the National Weather Service that there was a tornado that hit this neighborhood on March 14th, 1933. As I scrolled down and read through this document, there were streets that were listed, and I was able to check on various maps, and it doesn't look like this area of Boscobel Street was directly impacted. So followed that avenue of research, and I'll keep it in mind in case it needs to be addressed in additional detail. Currently, I'm turning to a more traditional genealogical source, which is city directories. And over on MyHeritage, there is a Nashville city directory for 1898. So that is very close to 1900 when the census indicated Erskine Reed lived at 627 Boscobel. So I'm going to click over and look at an enlarged page that does indeed list Erskine Reed. It actually lists his work. And so this does come into play in this research because, as you might suppose, there's lots of things I've encountered that haven't directly impacted the answers that I'm looking for. And so I haven't included them in the video. But I've been able to find a lot about his work for the Presbyterian Church and on behalf of foreign missions. And I don't know exactly why, but he tended to rent houses that were indeed owned by the church. And so that may be important in our research going forward. I haven't been able to conclusively determine whether the church owned this property, but I know that Erskine didn't and his family didn't live here very long, and that there's many different residences along Boscobel Street that he did live in. that were owned by this church. So what this does tell us, though, is that his home was 627 Boscobel in 1898. So there we now have two pieces of evidence that indicate Erskine Reed lived at 627 Boscobel and that it indeed existed. So I'm not ready to stop. It would be fine place for stopping, but I'm going to keep going forward in my research. It's always an internal dialogue to figure out when we have exhausted our research. And so I'm going to keep going in the MyHeritage city directories. And I just scrolled basically up on this city directory page. And what's interesting about MyHeritage is in this city directory database, they have a link that you can check that says, see who else lived at this address. My internet is slow today, so I'm going to go this way and get to that link. So now, as evidenced by these different people that lived at 627 Boscobel, 1897, 1914, 1901, people, all different names, 1905, again 1914, 1916. Looks to be in this database the latest date that I have for someone living at this house was about 1916. So we now have additional evidence, and I always encourage people to scroll through to the originals, and in this case a digital original, it would be just fine. And you might want to include these in your record that indeed other people lived at this address. So now we can reasonably conclude that the address of 627 Boscobel in Nashville, Tennessee did indeed exist. And so do I want to stop or do I want to go on? What I'm curious about is if I could find a picture of the house that he lived in. And so I'm going to continue on my research, and I will be updating you guys as to how that goes and what I discover. As always, please subscribe, check out the minute tips that came before this, and I look forward to talking with you soon.